The International Tennis Hall of Fame exists to preserve the history of tennis and celebrate the great champions, but it also acknowledges those who contribute massively to the sport off-court, and one of those contributor Hall of Famers is our guest today. Hi, I'm Patrick McEnroe, president of the International Tennis Hall of Fame, and we have a fascinating interview today charting the life and work of one of the greatest observers of modern-day tennis, Richard Evans.
They accepted that I could have dinner with them and have a beer with them and go to parties with them, and they realized I wasn't going to write about it. I wrote about their matches, and I didn't hold back on if, they played badly, I said so. And they respected that because I was a critic and they knew it. So I found myself running professional tennis in Europe, which was absolutely fascinating, because it was the attempt to knit together two worlds. The other piece of advice I would say is go, be there. You're never going to get work. You're never going to learn what you need to learn sitting on your couch at home watching television. If there's something happening in the world that you think you should be covering or could cover or know something about, be it sport, be it a war, be it a convention, be it whatever, meet people, talk to people, go.
As you can hear, Richard is British, but if there was ever a nationality called international, that would be him. Born in Paris, raised in England, lived in London, Monte Carlo, Washington, Florida, and he even covered aspects of the Vietnam War. Throughout that fascinating life, a single thread has been constant: his love of and dedication to the great game of tennis. Chris Bowers sat Richard Evans down a day after he was inducted into the Hall of Fame in July 2024.
Richard, we tend to start these interviews by asking the interviewee what they think it is that makes someone a Hall of Famer. You've been for many years on the International Tennis Hall of Fame Enshrinement Nomination Committee. Do you have your own definition, formula, template for assessing what it is that makes someone a Hall of Famer?
Well, I think achievement has to be top of the list. If you've won a lot of very big tournaments and been ranked very high in the world, then you put yourself in contention to be nominated. And I think it's pretty unfortunate for people like Christine Truman, who won a Grand Slam and never made the 75% bar that you have to reach to get elected by the 120-odd people who ultimately decide whether you're in the Hall of Fame or not. The criticism I have of us, because I'm part of it, is we don't give enough attention to what we call ourselves, which is the International Tennis Hall of Fame. And that should be recognized to a greater extent. I mean, Anna Ivanovic was very famous, not just because of her tennis, but because of how she looked. Lovely woman who played terrific tennis, and she was number one in the world, and she won a Grand Slam, and she was in a final of another Grand Slam. She didn't make the 75%, which I think is a shame, because, that's a pretty high bar. So I look for achievement, I look for personality, I look for character, and base my decision on that.
Well, you are now a Hall of Famer. We're talking with you, a very sprightly 85-year-old. You were almost immersed in tennis because, although you didn't know it at the time, you were christened by a man whose daughter went on to win Wimbledon. Bishop Wade, whose daughter Virginia won Wimbledon in 1977. How did you find that out?
My mum, who used to, she was a tennis fan of a moderate sort. She used to certainly watch Wimbledon. And she obviously saw Virginia Wade playing. And she said to me one day with a funny look on her face, she said, Wade, that name, it means something to me. Does Virginia Wade have any link to us somehow? What about the person who christened you in Paris? And I said, I don't know. So I went to Virginia and I said, did your father ever work at the British Church in Paris? Oh, yes, she said. And it was, in fact, a fact. When I went to Paris the next time, I went to the church and I looked up in the old register and I looked at 10th of February 1939 and there was Rector Wade, or whatever his religious title was at that stage.
I think he was a bishop. He went on to become Archbishop of Cape Town.
He certainly became an archbishop later in South Africa, yeah.
You didn't really play much tennis as a child. You first got into tennis professionally after becoming a journalist in your teens in the mid-50s. And then after your 2 years of compulsory military service, you were sent to Wimbledon to write Althea Gibson's column in a London newspaper. How did that happen?
Life is all about timing. It's such a cliche, isn't it? But for me, it is everything, because I did come out of the army, demobbed, Friday before Wimbledon. Queen's was right up against Wimbledon. In 1960, I was 21, and I walked into the Evening Standard offices on Shoe Lane, a mad newsroom with typewriters clattering and copy boys running around and yelling. But in the far corner was the sports desk, and the editor had left his office, so you knew something was on, as I learned later, because Charles Wintour, who was the best editor I ever worked for, and who was the father of Anna Wintour, who is somewhat famous in the fashion world, Charles was this erect, bespectacled, grey-haired gentleman who looked like a Cambridge Don and behaved like one. And he was in animated conversation with Peter Goodall, the sports editor of the Evening Standard, and they were in a panic because the person they had got to write Althea Gibson's copy the previous year had decided at the last minute he couldn't do it. He was the book editor and he had too many books to review. And Althea Gibson was, of course, the first black player ever to win Wimbledon. She'd done that 2 years before. She'd worked for the Standard the previous year. Now, who was going to write her copy at Wimbledon, which was starting on the Monday? And Charles completely changed my life by looking at Peter Goodall and then swinging around and pointing to me as I walked in the office and saying, "You've got this young man joining the paper today. Give him to Althea." And that changed my life.
So you ghostwrote Althea Gibson's column. What did you learn from that?
Well, I learned I had to find out a bit more about tennis. I'd played it at school. I'd watched Rod Laver lose to Alex Almeida on black and white television in my club in Piccadilly the previous year. So I followed it. You know, Ken Rosewall and Roy Emerson were names I saw in the A gate of the Daily Express, having lost to each other probably in Sydney or wherever. So all this was familiar to me, but I was no expert. And suddenly I was dispatched to Queen's then and there. I was in the office about 3.5 minutes. I was on the district line to Barron's Court. And I went up to Althea and said, "Hello, I'm Richard Evans. I'm writing your copy on Monday." And she was charming and said, "Oh, how nice to meet you." There I was, press box, centre court, Wimbledon, best seat in the house. She started analysing the matches and I started writing the copy. We formed a friendly relationship and I ended up taking her to the Wimbledon Ball, which in those days was the middle Sunday at the Grosvenor House, middle Saturday night. I said to her on about the Thursday, you're coming to the Wimbledon Ball. Everybody went in those days. It was a big deal. And she said, "No one's asked me." So I thought, really, I mean, are you serious? And then I realized she was serious. And I said, "Well, would you like to come with me?" She said yes. And I took her round to our flat in Park West, which was practically walking distance from the Grosvenor House, so that my mother could give her a cocktail. And my mother was just a little bit nervous. She had never entertained socially a black person. It's very difficult to understand this in this day and age.
Well, I wanted to ask you that because you, a 21-year-old reporter, attending the Wimbledon Ball with a black woman at that time, albeit a twice former singles champion and former doubles champion. I mean, given the attitudes of the time, did you get any odd looks or did you pick up any comments?
I never heard anyone say anything derogatory in my hearing, but I can only imagine as Althea and I walked down that grand staircase into the ballroom of the Grosvenor House, this unknown 21-year-old reporter and the black champion. I can only imagine what those old fuddy-duddies were whispering to each other at their tables. Probably horrific to have listened. But luckily I was on Ted Tinling's table. We'll talk about Ted later. And he, made everything happy. And I asked her if she'd like to dance. And there's a photograph in one of my books of us dancing. And the evening was splendid. And, she had been in that atmosphere before as champion. So it wasn't new to her. But the circumstances were different.
You only ghostwrote her column 1 year because the Evening Standard replaced her as a guest columnist with Jaroslav Drobný for the couple of years after. Now, you did ghostwrite his column. What did you pick up from that?
Everything. He was called the Professor. Old Drob, we called him, because he won Wimbledon at 34, I think. He'd lost in a couple of finals. He was the Czech exile who'd gone to Egypt to get out of Czechoslovakia and then come and settled in England and become a British citizen eventually with his sports shop at South Kensington. Drob was a real professor of the game. Tactically, technically, he could tell you everything. And his English was not 100% perfect, so I had to listen very carefully against the noise of the crowd as to what he was saying in my ear. But he taught me so much. I mean, why do you slice a backhand cross-court? Why did Chuck McKinley go down the line on that volley? Everything, because I had to write it, so I really had to listen. And over 3 years we did it, and I learned a great deal.
Do you think that was some of your best writing, given that you were brand new and therefore were probably on a much greater level of understanding for your readers?
Well, yes. I mean, I had to be Drobny's voice, so I had to sound as if I knew what I was talking about or what he was talking about, because it was all, Richard Evans talking to Jaroslav Drobný. Yes, it improved my writing and it improved my knowledge of the game.
At that time, as we mentioned a few minutes ago, you also were in Ted Tinling's orbit. I mean, Tinling was a remarkable man. We think of him as a dress designer, but he was used by Wimbledon as a player liaison person. He was also an official of tennis. How did you get in with Tinling?
It was how did he come to me, because that was how he operated. If he saw someone new in the game coming in and he made his assessment with his large intellectual mind as to what sort of person they were, and if in his view they were promising, acceptable, whatever, he drew them in. He was Mr. Communicator. He introduced people to each other, and one of his greatest things he did for people was if he'd heard Billie Jean King say something nice about Carol Gravener, he would relay that to Carol. And he would say, oh, Billie Jean was saying blah, 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 blah. And it made the person feel, oh, really, that's nice. And it boosted people's egos and self-confidence. And that is what Ted did. And
do you know what it was he saw in you?
He wanted to bring me into the game. Ted wanted to draw me in because he found me an attractive personality on some basic level, and wanted new blood in the game and saw potential in me as a writer. And, I mean, he really drew me in by inviting me to a meeting of players in his flat on the Gloucester Road to discuss colour in his dresses, because there'd been a huge row the year before when he put mauve, I think, or purple panties underneath Maria Bueno's dress. Every time she served, it flared up, and then in the eyes of the All England Club Committee, contravened the all-white rule. But Ted, sharp as ever, said, I asked them about it, and they said it had to be 51% white. He said, doesn't that give me 49% colour? Which they hadn't thought of. So he called this meeting, Sandra Reynolds, Renee Skirman, Anne Jones, Christine Truman, to have a conference about this. What should we do about this? How much colour can I put in your dresses? What do you think? And we had this major summit, which was amazing looking back on it. to determine how much colour he could put in. And of course he didn't go with 49%, but he did weave in little bits here and there. And, I was the only reporter there. I'd been in the game. There was 61 or 62. And so that is how he brought me into tennis. He also introduced me to Angela Buxton, who was the only person who volunteered to play doubles with Althea, women's doubles, and they won, of course, which put a lot of noses out of joint. She was a Jew and therefore understood discrimination and became a very close friend and confidant of Althea right the way through to the end. We went up to her house in North London, Golders Green, I think, and I remember a tea party there. And so Ted was this Mr. Communicator. He drew me right into the heart of the game. And that also, if I can leap forward, was the case when I emigrated to America in 1965 with my then wife Glenys and covered the US Championships for the first time. He introduced me to another very imposing character in the game, Gladys Hellman, who was editor of World Tennis Magazine, and almost immediately asked me to cover the tournament for her and write for her regularly. And I became very friendly with Gladys and ended up going to stay at her house in Houston.
Did you ever wonder how Ted Tinling might have smiled if he'd been around to see the decision Wimbledon made a couple of years ago to allow the women to wear dark-coloured undershorts?
Yeah, I'm sure he was noticing that irony. A lot of things have changed, but the game of tennis would be so much better off if Ted had been around with his input and insight. His knowledge of the game was amazing, and he played Bill Tilden pre-war and Lou Hode post-war, which is a very long time between champions, and he played both. He dressed both. He was just someone who the game could have done with because he always had insight. I mean, technically, tactically, if I was covering a match on centre court and something strange happened, the first person I ran to was Ted. And I'd said, Ted, why did Billie Jean never go down the line? And he said, well, of course she wasn't going to down. That idiot linesman who gave her all those bad calls last year was on that line. She wasn't going to give him another chance. Ah, okay. Well, that's answered that question. But that was Ted Tinling. He just saw things other people didn't see.
We're talking about the early 60s, where you did the Gibson and Drobný columns for the Evening Standard and were very much in Ted Tinling's orbit. Then you had 10 years which you devoted very much to news journalism, where you were a correspondent in Washington for 4 years, you were in Paris for a couple of years, you went to Asia, you were in the Vietnam and Cambodia areas during the wars there, and yet you only ever missed 2 Wimbledons. Does that mean that...
No, I missed 1 Wimbledon then.
You missed 1 Wimbledon?
Yeah, and 1 French.
Oh, you only missed 2 slams then. Does that mean that you came back from whatever you were doing almost religiously to do the tennis majors?
Well, I mean, it all depends on my editors again. Glenys and I, with not a great deal of money in our pocket, emigrated to New York, and I did have a gig with CBS. There was a program called Worldwide Sports. And so I had that little bit of work, and that translated into other little bits of work, and I was freelancing, and Glenys was working, and we were hanging on. And I started doing some stuff for John Gold, who was the Evening News, London Evening News correspondent in New York. I'd been working originally for the Evening Standard, the rival paper. And I did some stuff for him, and John was obviously impressed enough to offer me his job when, against all norm, it didn't happen, if it ever happened, that he was called back to London to become editor of the paper. Usually foreign correspondents would maybe go home and they spent time on the desk. He was made editor of the paper overnight. And before he left New York, he said, do you want my job? And that changed my life too, because it gave me this incredible beat. The mid-60s were an enormous news period of non-stop tragedies and disasters, but great stories as well.
And how much was tennis part of that beat?
The US Open. If I hadn't been a tennis writer, as the New York correspondent of the Evening News, I'd have covered the US Open probably, and that would have been it. But John, knowing how connected I was, allowed me to take 3 weeks off in the middle of the summer to cover Wimbledon and to cover, obviously, the US Open and some other North American tournaments. And all through this time, I was also able to write a column for World Tennis Magazine. So I never let go of tennis. I was always involved, despite having a pretty big news beat to deal with.
And during those 10 years, 60s and early 70s, you were the same age as that remarkable crop of Australian players who had dominated the Davis Cup through the 50s and 60s and dominated early years of open tennis. How did you get almost embedded with them?
By being the same age and liking Aussies, because they're special people, I think. They've got a way with them that, they'll take you for what you are. They won't start judging you for class or colour or anything else. If you're a bloke they can have a beer with, you're in. Ken Rosewall was about 5 years older, but Rod Laver's my age, and Roy Emerson a couple of years older, and John Newcombe and Tony Roach just a bit younger. And I found myself as a freelance later on the road internationally, going to tournaments I could afford to go to, and traveling with these guys. Occasionally someone like Barry Lodge from the San Diego paper joined us, but basically it was local people for each city we went to, but the only traveling guy with them was me.
And did they trust you? I mean, you're a scribe.
Yeah, they had to. They accepted that I could have dinner with them and have a beer with them and go to parties with them, and they realized I wasn't going to write about it. I wrote about their matches, and I didn't hold back on if, they played badly, I said so. And they respected that because I was a critic and they knew it.
So they trusted you not to use any inside information that you gained from socializing? Yes,
absolutely. And they became friends. I mean, I'm really honored to think that, Rod Laver and Ken Rosewall, John Newcombe, Tony Roach, the whole gang, there was such a list. And they were all such great players and people.
Do you think that the promotion of tennis has lost something by the fact that today's writers and broadcasters about tennis cannot get anywhere near as close to the top players because of the protective role that player agents have?
Enormously. It's my biggest bugbear about today's circuit, that there's a barrier put up between us. It doesn't matter to me because I know the coaches. If I don't know them, I know the coaches. But for a young journalist joining the tour, how does he get to know anybody outside of a formal press conference, which is not knowing anybody at all? I mean, you get some idea of what they're like. And only a few tournaments, like Queen's, for instance, can you actually eat with the players, stand in line for your ice cream or whatever and find out which football club they support, or maybe their sister's been ill in hospital, by just chatting. And by knowing them, you not only write better about them, but you write more sympathetically about them because we're human beings. And if you realize what someone's been going through in their private life, not scurrilously, but just normal private life, you will write through a different lens, and they will become more human to the reader. Okay, we miss out a little bit. The people who miss out are the players. And you cannot get that through to the agents, and as a result of that, to the tournament directors, who are terrified of doing anything that would upset the player through the agent. And it is so difficult to get through to tournament directors that by barring the media from the player lounge, it is the players who lose out, and of course the readers, the fans. They don't know the players as well as they could if the writers knew the players as people. And one day, hopefully, people will come to realize that.
In the early days of professional tennis, there was almost these two worlds where the players were professional, but the administration of tennis wasn't. And that came to a head at Wimbledon in 1973 when there was the boycott. Off the back of the boycott, the ATP approached you and said, will you help us promote tennis? And you became European Director of the ATP. What did that work involve?
Well, can we backtrack a bit?
Sure.
I'd been the Evening News correspondent in New York. John Gold then said, do you want to go to Paris? I've got a vacancy at the Paris office, and Bobby Kennedy had been assassinated, and if I'd stayed, I would be writing about Richard Nixon. And I thought, A, I don't want to write about Richard Nixon, and two, I'm Parisian. I was born there, and my father was still living there. So the choice was pretty easy. And I said, yes, I'll take the Paris job. So I moved to Paris. I was Paris correspondent for about 2 years, and John Gold ceased to be editor. And the new editor eventually said to me, I'm sorry, nothing to do with you. We can't afford a Paris bureau anymore. So they closed the office. So I was out of a job. I continued to work for them. I went back to the States and covered the 1972 presidential election for them as a freelance, and did various other things, but basically I was a freelance to do what I want. And so we went through Open Tennis in '68, and then everything came to a head with that Wimbledon boycott of 1973 over the Pilic affair. Had nothing really to do with Pilic, although that was a very good excuse. The players, who were very militant, Cliff Drysdale was president, the first president of the ATP, and he canvassed the locker room, and he and a couple of other players were surprised by the level of militancy that he found when he started talking about a boycott. And they said, yes, we are fed to the teeth of being told what to do by amateur officials when this is our livelihood. We are professionals, and this is a situation that cannot and must not continue. That was the clear message. Jack Kramer was the CEO of the ATP, and everybody in the British press, because they couldn't turn John Newcombe and Ken Rosewall and Rod Laver into villains, they had to find a villain because Wimbledon was being attacked, and so Jack Kramer was the fall guy. And as a result, sadly, he lost his job with the BBC as a fabulous partnership with Dan Maskell on BBC television. The press in Britain blamed Jack Kramer. Had very little to do with him, although he was fully supportive. He was going to do what the players wanted. So we got to that situation of the boycott, where 90 players on the eve of Wimbledon decided they weren't going to play, proving a certain USTA official wrong when he said, I think he told Dennis Ralston, and Dennis Ralston told us, he said, you guys will boycott any tournament in the world, you'll never boycott Wimbledon. Wrong. And the 90 players just proved it. So there was this huge boycott of Wimbledon, and the press in Britain were vicious. Go home, Kramer, we don't want your kind here, was a front page Evening News headline, sadly. And that was what we were dealing with. We went to a High Court judge. Cliff Drysdale went and spoke to the Eldon Griffiths, the sports minister in Westminster. I mean, it was daily headlines for a week. And the ATP came out looking pretty bad in England, at least, if not other places in the world. And so sometime around September, I think it was, Arthur Ashe and Donald Dell came to me and said, you know, we took a battering. We need someone who knows how to handle the press. Would you like to join us? And I was thinking, wow, a regular salary. I was, as a freelance, you live from meal to meal. And anyway, it was something I felt I could do and wanted to do. So I said yes. And after about 6 months, Pierre Darmon, the former French number one, who was running the Paris office, decided to leave to form his own business, sporting goods business. And so they came to me and said, do you want to move up and become European director? So I found myself running professional tennis in Europe, which was absolutely fascinating, because it was the attempt to knit together two worlds.
And one of the most fascinating stories that you tell in your memoir, The Roving Eye, is of a tournament in Florence where the South African player John Ewell was spoken to inappropriately by a tournament official. Can you tell that story?
Yeah, my job basically was to professionalize amateur tournaments, all run in country clubs. And the people, the committees of those clubs thought they were very important. And one gentleman in a blue blazer in the Circolo club in Florence, Firenze, did indeed come up to John Ewell, who'd spent 2.5 hours in Florentine heat in singles, and he had a cup of tea. I can see him drinking his cup of tea, pouring with sweat, trying to catch his breath. And this official came up to him and said, "Ewell, doubles, you're on court now." And I got him by the shoulder and spun him round physically. And I said, "You will never talk to one of my players like that again. They will be respected. Mr. Ewell needs time to recover from his singles. In half an hour, he will be ready to play." And the guy was so shocked. He'd never been spoken to like that by anybody in the tennis world. But I just wasn't going to have it. You had to put your foot down, because some of them, led by Basil Ray, the only professional from the ITF who sat at Barron's Court and acted like some potentate. He ordered Mark Cox and Arthur Ashe off a practice court at 6 p.m. because their time was up. But did anybody else want the court? No. It was just Basil Ray throwing his weight around. And that's what we were dealing with all the time. And I had some nice examples. In Barcelona, the Real Club de Barcelona, which was founded in 1899, the gentleman who ran it, whose name will come back to me in some other age, was very anglicized. He always wore English tweeds and was a charming chap. But the players had to pay for their towels and pay for their practice court and pay for their practice balls. And I said, let's have a coffee. Let me talk to you about this. I said, this is a change we have now. These are professionals. They are not generally going to run off with the towels or the balls, and you must treat them like professionals. And he said, oh, right. I think you've made me very angry, but I will go away and think about it. And he had a sense of humor, and indeed that, stopped that. Another example was the Monte Carlo Country Club, where a very fine journalist who ended up as editor of the New York Herald Tribune, John Vinegar, he was a top-class journalist, and he came down to cover the tournament because he liked tennis, and he found out that, and wrote about in the Herald Tribune, that the players were not allowed to eat in the club dining room, and they would eat on the terrace. And sometimes it is very cold in Monte Carlo during the tournament, and to make players sit out in the cold to have their meals was absurd. And John Vinegar wrote this big piece in the Herald Tribune about it. That changed that. Players, after that, ate in the dining room.
How long did it take to win that battle? When do you feel that, by and large, the administration of tennis had caught up with the professionalization of the players?
It took a while. I mean, I succeeded at some places and didn't succeed so quickly in others. And I remained in that job till 1977. By then, it had changed pretty much. I mean, I think I did a reasonable job in Europe. I don't know what was going on in America, but it did change. But it changed over time. You know, these things don't happen just like that.
One of the names that I associate with your career is Arthur Ashe, a remarkable man. And you were with him on his trip to South Africa after the South African government, in the era of apartheid, white majority rule, race-based constitution, had denied him twice a visa. On the third occasion, he was given it after intervention from Gladys Heldman. What was that trip like?
That trip was historic, and it was fascinating. been on 2 trips to Africa before. Donald Dale had organised through the State Department trips in 71 to English-speaking countries, which Arthur did with Stan Smith, and then in 72 to French-speaking countries with Tom Ocker and Marty Reeson and Charlie Passerelle. It was Charlie Passerelle's honeymoon, so we had Mrs. Passerelle with us, and they were stories in themselves. But South Africa was very special, obviously, exacerbated by Arthur for once saying something undiplomatic. They should drop a bomb on Johannesburg, which didn't go down very well with the Afrikaner government. And the person who is left out of the very good documentary that we've just seen in London, that I was invited to.
The Storyville one.
Yes, is Owen Williams. Donald might have suggested that he arranged the whole thing, but it was Gladys Hellman in her garden in Houston with Owen Williams, who was former #1 South African player and who transformed the South African Open, sitting in Gladys's garden and being virtually ordered to do something about the fact that Arthur Ashe wasn't allowed in. Go and see the president, said Gladys. And Owen had access to President Botha, and so he was convinced that he could do that. So he did. And
it was the Prime Minister John Forster, wasn't it, at the time?
At the time, it might have been Forster.
Forster, yeah.
Okay.
But he was quite intransigent.
Very. But Owen is very persuasive. And he said, you know, you seem to be afraid of Arthur Ashe. Arthur might be afraid of you. He's not going to come here and cause a revolution. He wants to see how this country works. And you would do yourself a lot of good if you allowed someone of Arthur Ashe's stature to come and play in the South African Open. And amazingly, they said yes.
But Arthur insisted that the crowds, blacks, whites and coloureds, the 3 designated racial groups in South Africa at the time, should be allowed to sit together. Did that happen?
There was an arrangement that should happen. It wasn't quite as 100% integrated as Arthur would have wanted, but certainly that happened. Certainly Owen Williams invited black chieftains like Buthelezi to the tennis, and the coloured president of the Coloured Association was there because, as you know, South Africa under apartheid, it wasn't just black and white. Anyway, so it was integrated, but the deal was that Arthur, when he was in South Africa, would say nothing or write nothing derogatory about the regime or the government. Obviously, when he left, he could do what he wanted, but they didn't want him, reasonably enough, running around South Africa calling them all sorts of names.
Arthur got to the final, inconveniently lost to Jimmy Connors. Did, though, just getting to the final, or even just playing, winning his first match against Sherwood Stewart, did that actually help move the needle?
Well, it was very complicated. We get back to that. There was this poet, Don Matera, who incredibly wrote this poem that got Arthur. I mean, you read the poem and you thought, yes, 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 this is Arthur Ashe. And he arranged a meeting with black journalists in a steamy hall, about 200 black journalists, for Arthur to address. And hilariously, if you want to look at it like that, something had happened during Arthur's visit that was the last thing the government wanted to happen, because they wanted to present the best face of South Africa, and they managed to produce and present to Arthur the worst, because they had banned Don Matera 3 weeks before. And because they couldn't stop the bureaucratic machinery, the announcement of Don Matera being banned came out in the middle of Arthur's visit. And so when we arrived for the meeting in the hall, everybody was flooding in, and being banned, for those who don't know, meant that you couldn't meet publicly with more than one person. You were virtually housebound. But
so Don couldn't attend the meeting that he'd arranged?
He had to come up to Arthur, standing separate with the boss guys with their dark glasses standing near, and saying to Arthur, I'm terribly sorry, but I can't join you in the meeting because I'm banned. So Arthur got it full face, up front, This is South Africa. The South Africa the government didn't want him to see. So we go into the meeting, and I heard as we walked in someone say Uncle Tom, and the meeting was hostile. Most of those journalists didn't want Arthur in South Africa.
Uncle Tom was a traditional American insult by blacks against blacks.
Yes, and they didn't want him there. They said vociferously, you being here, it's all very fine. You're staying in a white man's house. You're just making it easy for the government. And Arthur had to face this. And I was full of admiration for him, because the teaching he'd received from his mentor, Dr. Johnson, who he went to live as a teenager in Virginia, leaving home in Richmond, the teaching that Dr. Johnson had pummeled into him. He said, you're moving into a white world. When you join the tennis circuit, you will be in a white world. Never give the white man an excuse to criticize you. Big time order. And not many black people would have been able to carry it out. Arthur happened to have this temperament that he could internalize, and he presented himself as this elegant, well-spoken, well-educated, calm human being, and he never snapped back at whatever remark was made. Many remarks were made in jest by his fellow players in the locker room, like Sherwood Stewart, stuff that a lot of black people would have reacted badly. Arthur just smiled, and he handled this criticism in this steamy hall by giving his version. He said, I hear what you're saying. I understand what you're saying, but I couldn't criticize South Africa with any knowledge if I didn't come. I needed to come to see for myself, and that's why I'm here. And he handled it very calmly, and they had to admire him. And then we went on to Stellenbosch University to meet a professor who professed to be an even-handed man on the subject of apartheid, and he had 2 or 3 of his students with him, standing behind him, interjecting, saying, yes, you see, the professor says this, and it's all fair, and, we acknowledge the black man and respect him, and all this blah, blah, blah. And with us was a very well-dressed, in his green jacket, I can see it, the president of the Indian Tennis Federation. And we argued, and I started to get a bit annoyed halfway through, and Arthur looked over to me and gave me one of his looks, which said, shut up. And so I calmed down. When you say Indian Tennis Federation, do you mean the Tennis Federation of India or the Indian ethnic group in South Africa? Ethnic group in South Africa, right. Yeah. There were coloureds, yep. There were Indians, okay. There were blacks. This is what I say. It was a complicated deal, and you had to be there to understand it. I got such a quick lesson in the first few days, I was dizzy. But he was there as president of the South African Indian Tennis Federation. So we came to the end of this hour-long conversation, which got a little bit fractious, but was all under control. And Arthur finally said to the professor, answer me one question. He said, you've tried to explain why apartheid is a reasonable form of government. This gentleman here, who's president of the Indian Federation, cannot vote, but you can. How do you justify that? There was a long, deathly pause, and the professor said, Mr. Ash, I cannot answer you. And we got up and left. And that was Arthur. He just waited to, boom, serve the ace at the end, and there was no return. I need to ask you about 2 other experiences with Ash. One was another trip to Africa, where you were in Cameroon, and you, quite by chance, discovered a boy who, a decade later, became the last French man to win Roland Garros. We were invited to the Yaoundé Tennis Club for dinner. As I said, there was Tom Ocker, Marty Rees and Charlie Passerelle and Arthur Ashe and some colleagues. Frank DeFord and Bud Collins were along on the trip, and we were visiting French-speaking countries. And it so happened, by chance, I got into the cab with Charlie Passerelle and Arthur Ashe. And we said, Yaoundé Tennis Club, and he dropped us off. And there was a path leading up to the clubhouse, and it was divided by a clump of palm trees, as totally normal. You make these decisions in life without any conscious reason why you do them. If we'd gone right around that clump of palm trees, you'd have never heard of Yannick Noah. We went left around the palm trees, and right there was a tennis court, yellow lights, big, large insects on the baseline, which the young boy had to sweep off with his battered Dunlop Max Ply. And he was playing, he was 11 years old, and he was playing with his uncle. And we were on the lookout for young players. We'd given a clinic the day before with about 30 young boys. Presumably Yannick was amongst them. But it's a gesture. You're not going to find players like that. But Arthur said, let's see if this kid can play. And so we stood there for about 3 minutes, and Arthur called him over. And he then drew out of his racket bag, like Excalibur, this shiny new metal Kevlar head racket, which was brand new. No one had ever seen a racket like this. And he handed it to Yannick and said, here, try this. The boy looked up. I can see him look up. So, merci, monsieur. Then Yannick went back to the baseline and played the most important point of his life. And no matter what he did later, it didn't matter, because he had this racket in his hand, which had been daunting for anyone. And he hit a huge first serve and raced to the net and put away a backhand volley. I can see it to this day. And Arthur, who's not given to hyperbole or great excitement, turned to us and said, kid can play. And so we watched him a bit more, and he went on hitting well. And eventually we went into the clubhouse, and Arthur asked someone, said, who's the kid? And they said, oh, well, his father's standing over there. You can go and talk to him. And his father was an international professional soccer player for Cameroon. And Arthur said, your son is talented. He can play, but he's never going to get anywhere here. America or France is where you'll have to send him if you want him to become a tennis player. And his father said, well, that's easy. His mother lives in Nice. And he'd been divorced from his white French wife, who was living in Nice. And again, timing. The French Federation had opened their first ever academy outside Paris about 6 months before. So within 6 weeks, Arthur was installed with his mum and the French Federation Academy in Nice. And he took it from there.
And were you on centre court when Arthur played doubles with Yannick at Wimbledon?
Yes, pretty emotional moment. By then, Yannick had grown. He was quite small. I remember I hadn't seen him for about 6 months, and I walked into the locker room at Roland Garros, and I was confronted by this tall young man. And I said, is that you, Yannick? And he said, oui, c'est moi. And he just sprouted. So he walked out onto the centre court as this tall young man alongside his discoverer, and they played doubles, which was a great moment.
Talking about the centre court at Wimbledon and Arthur Ashe, it was one of the most remarkable matches ever, the Wimbledon final of 1975, which, when I've been asked to give my top 10 all-time greatest matches, that's definitely one of them. 4 sets defeat for Connors, as well number 1 by Ashe. What do you remember about that match?
Everything, because it was the most interesting match I've ever watched. Certainly the most interesting Grand Slam final, because the background was that Jimmy Connors was an outcast, outlaw. He created that image for himself by being a loner, not making friends, being managed by a very strange gentleman called Bill Reardon, who was ostensibly working for the USTA or under the umbrella of the USTA, but ran his own tournament in Salisbury, Maryland, his own way with his own rules, and tried to form his own player association. And the ATP was still very young itself. And Bill Reardon decided to sue the ATP, Arthur Ashe, its president at the time, for not enabling him to develop his association. So when those two walked on court together, Arthur Ashe and Jimmy Connors, they were in litigation, personally and through their organizations, which was a very strange situation. So that in itself was very strange. But Arthur knew that if he wanted to seize this one chance, he knew it was going to be his last chance. He was 32. He wasn't going to get to another Wimbledon final. And he wanted, obviously, more than anything to be Wimbledon champion. But he was playing Jimmy Connors, who, apart from anything else, was the hot player of the tour. Marty Reeson told me in the locker room, we thought he was invincible. He was beating everybody. He was winning every tournament. And Arthur, in particular, knew that the mountain he had to climb to beat him was very, very high, because he always lost to him. Because Jimmy Connors loved playing, and indeed had to play to win, against power hitters. Because Jimmy Connors couldn't create power himself. Small guy, little guy. That's why I used that dreadful metal racket that no one else could use.
With a tiny sweet spot.
With a tiny sweet spot, with no topspin. He hit it flat and straight and true.
His hand-eye coordination must have been extraordinary.
Absolutely extraordinary. He was a great player from that point of view. But he fed off his opponent's power. So off went Arthur Ashe, Charlie Passerelle and Donald Dell to the Playboy Club for dinner the night before, which is one of their haunts in Park Lane in those days, perfectly respectable thing to do. And they plotted a tactical plan for Arthur to use against the man he couldn't beat, because they all knew that if Arthur went out and played as Arthur Ashe, he'd lose. And the plot was give him no power, drop shot him, lob him, push the ball over the net, deprive any speed that Connors could use against Ashe. And in other words, you were asking a professional athlete of 32 to go and play the most important match of his life by far, totally contrary to his natural instinct, totally contrary to any style he'd used before, ever in his career. And Ashe did it. For 2 sets, Connors was completely bewildered. He was virtually pulling his hair out because he was getting drop shot. Arthur was bringing him in, and because of his grip, there was an area of the court that if you got the ball into that area and asked him to volley on his forehand side, he couldn't get the ball over the net and into the court. He could get the ball into the net and he could get the ball over the baseline, but he couldn't get it into the court. Just geometrically, it couldn't happen. But you had to be precise, and that is what Arthur did. And Connors was going nuts, and someone called out something derogatory from the crowd. And
come on, Connors.
Jimmy called back, "I'm trying, for God's sake." And he didn't know what to do. But he did get his act together. Arthur became a little less precise, and Connors, to his credit, came back and won the 3rd set. Now, at that point, so many people would revert to type. They would panic. They would think this worked for a couple of sets, but it's not going to work anymore. And, go back to wham, bam, thank you, ma'am, which was the way Arthur played. But he didn't. Arthur stuck to the original plan. And Jimmy Connors fell apart all over again and lost in 4 sets. And Arthur pulled off the most amazing strategic and tactical victory that I've ever seen anyone do.
In the history of tennis, what place does Arthur Ashe warrant? Obviously, he has the main stadium at Flushing Meadows named after him. Because he was such a statesman in terms of a pioneering black person, does he have a greater status than perhaps his tennis achievements warrant, or do you think that he's right up there on both counts?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, he wasn't one of the greatest players of all time. He was a great player because he won Grand Slams. He won the US Open, he won Wimbledon, he won Australia more than once, I think I'm right in saying. He won the doubles in Roland Garros. only because he was staying in my apartment, of course.
Of course.
That was the only clay court tournament he won in Europe, was the doubles at Roland Garros with Marty Riessen. So he wasn't one of the greatest. He was one of the great players. You don't win that many Grand Slams. And in the style in which he played, people loved watching him. He was exciting. He was an attacking player, and he won a lot of tournaments. But he became iconic in sporting history for what he did off court as well, and representing his race so well, and becoming more militant as he went through life. He was heavily criticized by Jesse Jackson and various other black leaders for not being aggressive enough. Some of them, like Andrew Young, who married him at the United Nations when Andrew Young, later mayor of Atlanta, was UN ambassador, said, Arthur has his own style, let him do it. This is the way he does it. And to suggest that he's not in our camp as far as philosophy about race relations is concerned is ridiculous. He is doing it his way. He went to South Africa. He talks to people at meetings, but he's not a screamer and a shouter. And later he became more militant. Later he got arrested in Washington for demonstrating against apartheid. But he did it his way, learning from what he was taught by Dr. Johnson, that you get things done in various ways in life. And he had his personality and his way of doing it.
You got into broadcasting in the early 80s when you approached a BBC executive and said, can you give me a chance? What was it about broadcasting that attracted you, and where do you feel that you were able to contribute as a broadcaster in a way that was different from as a writer?
It is a very different job, but it's all under the headline of communications and telling people things they don't know. That's what you do as a writer, hopefully. And I cut my teeth on broadcasting because someone, and I have no idea who, my second year covering Wimbledon, someone came up to me and said, CBS Sports want a report on Wimbledon of 45 seconds to be broadcast, I think it was live, to New York every night, and you can do it out of the BBC studio in Portland Place. And would you do it? Would you be interested? And I thought, oh, wow, okay. Yes, I mean, I'm not going to say no. So
you're a freelance, you make the money.
Well, yes, I got a fortune every night, £2 and sixpence, I think. But anyway, so I turned up at a broadcasting house at 11 o'clock at night into that rabbit warren of a building, which you can get lost in forever because Studio 3E or 3A is not on the third floor, it's on the fourth floor. I mean, it's hopeless. And so the commissioner sort of tells you where to go. You find the studio, and suddenly New York's on the line, and I'd written a script of 45 seconds, and I broadcast. I remember being very nervous that first few times. Later, thank God, I'm not nervous now making a speech. That was my broadcast career up till then, and that was all I did. So I thought I can speak into a microphone. I can do that. And I was listening to someone whose name I've actually forgotten, but he was one of the lesser Australians who'd been hired by BBC Radio. And I listened to him and I thought, mate, you're a great bloke, but you're not a great broadcaster. And I think I can do better. That's what I felt.
And do you look back and say, this match stands out as one of my best broadcasts? In as much as you look at great tennis matches that you've reported on, do you look at a certain match and think, I did a great job there?
I don't. There are too many of them. What I did do was go to Slim Wilkinson, head of the BBC's Radio Sport, and say, can you give me a shot at this? And he said, yes. He was obviously looking for someone. And I went down to Queen's. They stuck me in the box at the back of the court, put the headphones on and said, go. And nobody told me how to broadcast or commentate play by play. I had Christine Truman sitting next to me as my summarizer, And in my whole broadcast career, the only person who gave me any tips was Barry Davis, who was one of the great football commentators for the BBC. And he gave me a few tips because he was a great bloke. But otherwise, I just learnt, and I made mistakes as I went along. And I found I could talk at sufficient speed, not the speed of Max Robertson, who I took over from eventually at Wimbledon, who amazingly didn't miss a shot in a rally, which was almost impossible. I sort of skipped the odd shot in a rally and kept it going.
Well, you have to these days because the rallies are longer.
Well, exactly. In those days, people served and volleyed non-stop at Wimbledon. So if you got a rally of more than 4 shots, it was unusual. And it was much easier to keep up with the play. So that's what I did. I enjoyed so many of the matches I did. There were some great ones. You have the best seat in the house. I worked with Fred Perry for 6 years, which was fantastic. He was a benign gentleman by the time I worked with him. As a player, benign would not be a phrase that you would use.
I think that goes for a lot of tennis players as they get older.
They do. Pancho Gonzalez being one prime example, who I got to know very well at the end of his life. Fred was terrific. The thing that came across was his awe of the centre court. He mentioned it time and again, that you can play tennis anywhere in the world, but the centre court at Wimbledon, which was obviously the place where he won most of his important matches and became the player he was so special. And so it was lovely to have someone who'd done it, who'd been out there, sitting there next to you. And he used to write his answer his fan mail during the broadcast. And you'd think, are you watching this match? But he'd always be pinpoint with when I threw a question at him. He'd say, yeah, well, if the guy went down the line more, he'd probably do better.
So he was multitasking.
Yes, absolutely. And go back to his writing. And then after Fred, I got Fru Macmillan, who I worked with for years. And Fru, with his sharp brain and acid sense of humour, which he kept under wraps to a large extent.
Very dry sense of humour.
Very dry. Do you like your martini dry? Yes, would be the answer with Fru. But it had that ability that any summariser must develop, and some I worked with did not, of waiting for the commentator run out of steam, virtually practically run out of breath, and come in with 12 seconds of a point, boom. If he really needs to do this now, and not, whatever, but just something pertinent, on point, and shut up, and then let me pick up and continue. It was a great talent that Fru had.
I don't know if I'm allowed to mention this, but since you've put it in your memoir, The Roving Eye, I will feel I'm allowed to. You had a stammer as a kid, and you ended up as a high-quality broadcaster. Is there a lesson there?
Well, everybody deals with it in their own way. I was at prep school, maybe as a result of the bombing that we had for 14 consecutive nights in Surrey during the war, maybe the trauma of leaving France as a baby was subconsciously in my psyche. But by the time I got to prep school, I had a serious stammer, and being asked questions in class was a problem. So my mother, bless her, one of the many things she did for me was to find somewhere in the Bexhill area in Sussex a speech therapist, a Miss Scott, grey-haired, young woman to have grey hair, I remember. But she came to the school twice a week for 6 months, and she made me lie down flat on the floor and read to her and tell me to concentrate lying flat on the floor on my feet, which were getting heavy, weren't they? And then my ankles, you feel them getting heavy. And then your calf muscles, you feel the weight on the floor. You will relax, 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 let it go. And it worked.
Did Miss Scott ever hear you broadcast?
No, unfortunately. I mean, I'd lost touch with her, and she probably didn't survive that long. But
do you see that as a great human achievement?
Oh, absolutely. She should win an award, not just because I became a good broadcaster, but she succeeded totally. And the funny thing was, by chance, Reg Hayter, who was my first boss before the Evening Standard, ran a sports agency, had a terrible stammer. How he built that sports agency by persuading sports editors in Fleet Street to give him work, I have no idea, but he had a way with him. The people liked him. And so I went into this environment where every day, my first job, where I was obviously a little nervous, I was listening to someone stammer. And one day I walked into the office and was given the usual list of rugby results that I had to read over, copy takers in those days, to the Daily Telegraph. And I found I was saying, I was stammering. And I thought, oh, I won't say the word I said, but it was, oh God, or something like that, because the stammer had come back.
And that's picked up from Reg Hayter.
Association, presumably, and nerves. You see, I was nervous.
But it never came back again?
2 weeks I had it, and it disappeared.
Wow. So when you now think of yourself as a Hall of Famer, do you look back to the Miss Scotts, the youngsters who looked after this rather shy boy at primary school, and various other people, and say, wow, you have a share in all this?
Oh, absolutely. Through life, you can't achieve anything without help. Basically, we all need help, and it starts with the family. And it's something I want to emphasize, and Vijay Amritraj and Leander Pace, my co-inductees, both refer straight back to their families. And I knew Vijay's mother and father, and talk about a force of life. Maggie Amritraj was a force of life. And I believe that Leander's father is also in that category, and presumably his mother too. My father I didn't spend a great deal of time with, but he was always in my corner and helpful and supportive. But my mother was the parent that I grew up with and who kept telling me that I was wonderful. I was good looking, and that I was all these ridiculous things that one hopes to be, but needs to be told. You know, your self-confidence is built entirely on that. And I sort of, hopefully not an arrogant way, but I gained self-confidence. When I went for my first job, I thought, yes, I can do this. And where did that self-confidence come from? My mother. She told me I was wonderful, so obviously I could do it. And I used the two natural talents that I'd been given in school. I was useless at absolutely everything except history and English. I could write. I don't know why I could write, but I could write. I could write a good essay. And that's where my career sprung from. But it sprung from, and then, all the people who helped me. Joe Gaby, who introduced me to Reg Hayter, who was my cricket coach, and the guy on the gate at the Lord's Pavilion. I went to him and I said, I want to write about sport, and he introduced me to Hayters, and to Charles Winter, making that snap decision, give him to Althea, took me into tennis. These people obviously have been hugely influential in my career. And the two ladies I married, Glenys and then Lynn, who gave me Ashley, who is the pride of my life. And, you know, you need these people.
And now you're in the Hall of Fame as a contributor alongside other media people. There are a number of them, but I'll name just two because you've worked with them and looked up to them, David Gray and Bud Collins. How much do you think your inclusion in the Hall of Fame is a vote as much as anything for the role that the media play in the overall health of tennis?
Well, I'm glad that it's recognized, and I think it should be recognized because we are the showcase. We showcase the sport to the public. And this is what, getting back to my feeling about access to players, we present the players and the game to the public. And the levels of talent we have in doing that are very important to people's understanding of the sport. And so for the International Tennis Hall of Fame, with everything it means for excellence in the sport, to include as contributors journalists, I think is wonderful. I think it's correct. And I think it's very important. But I worry that the standard of reporting is not being allowed to be what it was in the days of David Gray and in his inimitable style, Bud Collins, and people like Geoffrey Green and John Parsons and Rex Bellamy, who was, almost a poet in his writing. And it's hugely important. Alison Danzig, going back to American tennis writing, was a huge factor in people's understanding of tennis in America when there were very few people covering tennis.
The 1930s.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We tend to end these podcast interviews by asking what advice you're comfortable giving youngsters or the parents of youngsters, or, in your case, anyone in tennis, including young reporters.
It's more complicated now because so many people are calling themselves journalists who only use social media, which you don't have to write, quote, properly, unquote. You can do a sort of shorthand of writing. I mean, I tweet a lot, and I've learned because of my radio work, where you had to write 30-second reports, maybe on the Vietnam War, which required a discipline in writing, and so I find tweeting very easy. But that shouldn't be the definition of you as a writer. And I would definitely advise any aspiring journalist to write long, to do essays, to write articles, to do writing that has nothing to do with social media, and write for magazines. And that is not necessarily prevalent today. The other piece of advice I would say is what I say in my book, The Roving Eye. Go, be there. You're never going to get work. You're never going to learn what you need to learn sitting on your couch at home watching television. If there's something happening in the world that you think you should be covering or could cover or know something about, be it sport, be it a war, be it a convention, be it whatever, go. Meet people, talk to people, because that's the only way that you learn properly. And if you're a freelance, it's the only way you'll pick up work. Because often I've decided to go to a tournament, and it was maybe a sort of run-of-the-mill tournament, and then something special happened, something newsworthy, and the editor back home in London thought, oh, God, who's in Hamburg? Oh, Richard Evans is there. Oh, okay, we need 500 words. And you only get that job because you were there. Go.
Richard Evans, thank you very much indeed for sharing your recollections of life in tennis.
What an amazing account of 65 years of observing tennis from the remarkable Richard Evans. And if you'd like to know more about the unique story of Arthur Ashe's visit to South Africa, which Richard Evans talked in great detail about, plus more about Althea Gibson, Richard's first entry into tennis reporting, there's a podcast in the Tennis Worthy series about the first 3 Black Hall of Famers, Althea Gibson, Arthur Ashe, and their mentor, Robert Johnson, that has a lot more about that historic trip to South Africa with the voices of others who were involved, including Owen Williams. Just go to tennisfame.com/podcast and scroll down until you find it. The Tennis Worthy podcast is brought to you by the International Tennis Hall of Fame. We're constantly updating our archive of interviews and features, so don't leave it too long before you check in with us again. I'm Patrick McEnroe, and thanks for listening.